Hi, this is Tony Stevens here, co-convener of Stand Up and coordinator of the Young Workers Resource Centre. You're watching this video because you're either a union member or official who's volunteered for our Stand Up for Students project, or you could be a new educator at the Young Workers Resource Centre. If you are one of our volunteers from the union movement, then congratulations, you're officially awesome. And if you're a Young Workers Resource Centre employee, you're still awesome, but you get paid to do this. Good for you. So, educating young people about employment law is vital to building youth density in the union movement, and that's one of the main reasons we're doing this Stand Up for Students project. To build youth density, to teach them about unions, but also to teach young people how to apply their rights in the workplace, and basically just teach them what their rights are, because they don't know. Empowering young people and increasing youth engagement with unions is a major objective as well. So there you go. If you are in it for those reasons, you're officially cool. In this video, I'm going to take you through the PowerPoint developed by the Young Workers Resource Centre that we deliver in secondary school classrooms all over the Waikato and Bay of Plenty. The reason we've started this project up in collaboration with the union movement and Stand Up is because we can't reach the rest of the country. So that's where you guys come in. The PowerPoint covers the fundamental employment rights and processes that we believe young people must be aware of when they enter the workforce, as much as we can squeeze into a 50-minute time frame anyway. On that note, the time frame is dictated by the generic school period, which is 50 minutes, so you are limited with the amount of information you can cover. And I just want to apologize if it sounds like I'm muffling underwater. That's just the limitations of this PowerPoint video procedure. So sorry about that. Alright, without further ado, let's get into this slide. It's time to give Stand Up and the YWRC a plug. Just briefly go over the two organisations, why we are working together, and what we believe in. Young Workers Resource Centre is committed to educating young people about their rights because they are usually unprepared, schools don't feature meaningful employment law education, and so many bosses exploit young workers. Stand Up is committed to growing the youth presence in the union movement by building youth density in unions and by developing young people in unions into leaders and giving them opportunities. Both have similar motivations and it's a natural fit. Both of us want all young people to be treated fairly and with respect in order to grow a just Aotearoa. So I'm going to take you through this presentation in a sort of first-person mode by explaining how I deliver this PowerPoint, but of course, feel free to inject your own style and personality into the mix, and even introduce your own discussion points. Think of this as your guidelines or handrail. This slide here is a brief slide where I explain why it's important to understand your employment rights and responsibilities. In truth, we focus considerably more on rights rather than responsibilities, but I put that in there to give the appearance of balance. I figure employers are very quick to let young employees know what their obligations are, but they're quite slow to help them understand their rights, and that's me being generous. So feel free to go into a little more depth than what this slide offers. You could give a personal example where you were able to apply your rights to your advantage. Opening the presentation with the minimum wage is really a great way to start the workshop. It brings the students into the workshop immediately, they understand the concept, and everyone wants to know how much they're going to get paid. It also allows for you to interact with the students immediately, and this sets the scene for the rest of the workshop in terms of their willingness to contribute. At this point, I tell the students that I will be asking them questions throughout the workshop to test their knowledge and bring them into the discussion. Successful answers will be compensated with some sugar of some variety, so bring some lollies along if you've got the budget for it. Trust me, it really helps. This is the first question, and I usually give them a maximum of 3 guesses before I tell them the answer. Hands have to be up, of course, or it can just turn into anarchy. Maybe you want that. The moment of truth. $14.75. This answer will likely need to be updated when the minimum wage is increased in April. Or maybe we are past April. I don't know when you're watching this video. Hopefully it has been updated and the resource is there ready to use. You could ask the students who is earning this rate, which is a good lead into the next slide. Youth rates. Ugh. Same deal as the previous slide. Bribe the students to guess what the current starting out rate is with the lure of candy. In case you didn't know, the starting out rate is set at 80% of the adult minimum wage. Workers must be raised to at least the adult minimum upon their 6-month anniversary and are entitled to be back paid if their employer is late to the party. A useful thing to add is that employers don't have to pay youth rates. It is a choice, and they can pay 16-year-olds more if they wish, / are decent human beings. You can also turn this into a discussion about fairness. Are youth rates fair? Why? Why not? Get them thinking about it, get them talking about it. This is really an extension of the previous slide, and I don't usually ask the audience to be involved too much. However, depending on your audience, it can be helpful to ask how many among the audience see themselves in an apprenticeship. The training wage is of course another aspect of the starting out rate, but can be paid to people who fit the criteria for the entire duration of their apprenticeship, unlike the time limit on the starting out rate. As long as it's official and has NZQA credits attached, of course. I have had cases where young people were paid a training wage because they were new to the job and thus in training. But this is bollocks because they were not enrolled in an NZQA approved course. You could use a story like that as an example to drive it home if you think that will help. Aha! This slide often catches students out. So ask the audience what the minimum wage is for 15-year-olds and younger, and if someone correctly answers it, they definitely deserve a Chupa Chup, Freddo, Redskin, whatever lollies you are working with. No minimum wage at all, so it's whatever the employer sees fit to offer. I also add that there's no minimum working age in New Zealand, only restrictions on what paid work can be undertaken by minors, usually determined by health and safety risks, training, etc. On this slide I give the students a quick overview of their minimum rights and explain that this is really the focus of the workshop. A one-liner like, this is what every single one of you can expect from every single job you get during your life, whether it be delivering newspapers as the paper boy or you're the CEO of Spark. Something like that can really help drive the point home. The following 5 to 6 slides focus on employment agreements, and this is probably the main subject matter I try to drive home with the students, as I feel this is the most relevant. At the Young Workers Resource Centre we encounter so many young workers who have never received an employment agreement or got it really late. And we also encounter a lot of young people who don't read their employment agreement. Of course, having an employment agreement, as you know, is a fundamental right for all workers and goes a long way towards making our working lives structured and harmonious and free of exploitation. It's also where young people might learn about their entitlements and conditions, or lack thereof, for the first time. So this section covers also the different types of employment, which is increasingly relevant to young workers who tend to feature in insecure jobs such as 0-hour contracts more than most. I usually use an activity that involves props to add another interactive element to the workshop, but you won't have props on hand. Basically the activity is around, they've got a set of cards and they have to separate the unlawful clauses from the lawful clauses. As an alternative without props, you could have a discussion with them, asking them a question: what would you expect to see inside your employment agreement if you started a job tomorrow? What are the fundamentals that have to be in there? You could also do an activity where you split them up in groups and get them to discuss what they want to see in a contract, and then get them to feed back to the main group. The next slide is where you can set them straight. Here we have the must-haves, the fundamentals. Go through each of these obligatory conditions and explain their nuts and bolts and give them some context if you can. Real stories really help at this point. You can even do an activity where you give pairs one feature each and have them come up with a scenario where it might matter. Then have them share with the group. Some of these conditions will get some more limelight in future slides as well, so don't get hung up on sort of complicated looking things like personal grievances and problem resolution guidelines at this stage. Where we have minimum entitlements there, that refers to the fact that every employment agreement must reference your minimum rights, including leave entitlements, etc. This slide here presents a useful discussion that while there are things that legally must be in every employment agreement, there are a range of other clauses and conditions that we may find in our contract, and that the bare minimum should not be a target for employers. If workers are to be treated fairly, an entirely different concept to legally, then they may need a bit more than just the must-haves. Use your own examples. If you're a union organizer, what about the example of the company vehicle, or the fuel card, or reimbursement? You don't have to pay for gas, do you? I hope you don't. Maybe you get a company car. Those sorts of things are relevant because you have to travel a lot on the job. So use examples like that. Maybe a job where you've had to work overtime because of the nature of the business. Explain what the overtime conditions were. On this slide, I usually ask the audience what they think are the key differences between these three types of employment before I outline them in my own words. It is useful to provide examples of jobs to give some context to the discussion. You could even come up with types of jobs and ask what contract they might be under and why. One thing I always do when talking about fixed term contracts in particular is I ask the students to come up with valid reasons for hiring someone on a fixed term and generate some discussion around the appropriateness of said reasons. Because of course, employers must have a valid reason. It can't be simply to preserve flexibility for themselves. Aha, the dreaded 0-hour contracts, harbingers of all things evil. Okay, maybe evil's a strong word, but I do believe that 0-hour contracts represent everything that is wrong with our labour market. Workers have little protection and even less influence. They are very hard to represent from a union perspective and have next to no bargaining power as an individual. Employers who use these tend to view employees as an expendable commodity rather than people, and tend to be fans of the capitalist dogma. Alright, rant over. Inform the audience that 0-hour contracts are out there, they're not uncommon, and they're popular in the sorts of industries where young people tend to get jobs, like cafes, petrol stations, bars, and fast food chains. Workers on these contracts are typically given no or very little fixed hours or shifts, but are required to be available for work at all times. Their rostered shifts can also be canned on short notice, and workers are usually prevented from taking secondary employment to bolster their already unpredictable income. But you knew all that. It's probably a good idea to touch on the new law coming at some stage this year. The Employment Standards Bill is still going through the parliamentary hoops, but when it becomes law, employers will be required to compensate workers for being on call, and in the event of cancelling a worker's shift also. This compensation is pretty vague, and it could be bloody anything at this point, from a cheeseburger to being simply tucked up into a salary package. So, not a fan. Any agreed hours will also need to be set down in the employment agreement also. But I think this proposed law is totally weak sauce. You know, the employer can still not give them fixed hours and still have an availability clause. So I really don't like it. The law's weak sauce. But you don't want to labour this point or you'll risk the content going over the students' heads. Get it? Labour the point? Haha. My other favourite thing, trial periods, yay! I think most students actually have a basic understanding of the idea of trial periods, but asking them what advantage they give employers is a great discussion starter. And you can use examples of legal versus inappropriate use of trial periods. Notice how I didn't say appropriate versus inappropriate? Think about that one. It's also useful to drive home how commonly trial periods are used when hiring young people. If I was to hazard a guess, in my own experience, I'd say 8 out of 10 young workers. For sheer shock value, I sometimes ask the audience, can you be fired without reason on a trial period? Most students are surprised at the answer. The next slide features the nuts and bolts. So yeah, it's balls. Okay, I don't tell them that, not in so many words, but feel free to discuss the trial period in terms of a conversation about fairness. They can be fired without being given a reason. It's also useful to compare the trial period dismissal process to a reasonable process under normal conditions and see which one the students think is best. Stress the fact that the 90-day clause must be included in the contract. Case law strongly implies that if the clause was not included in the contract prior to an employer's very first day of work, then they cannot be dismissed under the trial provisions. And of course, the same goes if an employee is not given a contract at all. No trial period there. Just going to have a sip of my coffee. This is where I get a bit paternal and urge students not to accept the job without an employment agreement, as well as encouraging them to take it home, read it carefully, and make notes on the parts that you don't understand or wish to discuss, and get some advice on it. Get some advice for Christ's sake, and from someone that they trust, an expert, someone in a union, or use the YWRC. We're happy to deliver that service. The reasonable time frame for signing a contract is not set in stone, but best practice seems to suggest between 2 to 5 days. And of course, the law rules. Contracts that undermine minimum conditions cannot be enforced, even if the employee is naive enough to sign. Your favourite section. Here I usually ask the class what they think a union is, just to see what they know and to prime them, and I will provide a candy prize if a student presents a satisfactory answer. You will probably find that the depth of knowledge around unions is very weak. And it's not uncommon for me, when I ask this question, to get a response like, oh, rugby union or credit union? They know more about a rugby union or a credit union than the union movement, and which one presents more value to society. So, discuss the advantages with them of a worker joining a union. Don't go hardcore into the process and all that stuff. We want to really drive home the values. At this point, if you have access to Wi-Fi, then you can play a video called "What Have the Trade Unions Ever Done for Us?" by clicking that picture with the fish eating a bigger fish. So the video is a British version of that popular Australian video that has the big old F-bomb at the end. You've probably seen it. This one features young people in it, so it's probably going to resonate more with them. They're working in a call center. It's not too bad, and it's a good break to have a video at this point as well. Wi-Fi access will need to be arranged with the teacher prior to the workshop, most likely, or just before you begin. Often teachers don't actually remember what the password is, and it can be a bit of to-ing and froing to figure it out, but if you prime them to it first, then, hopefully there's no problems. You can also briefly talk about collective bargaining, but I would focus only on the ideals of bargaining rather than the process. In my experience, the intricacies of this go over the head of most secondary school students, and for most of them, collective bargaining is not directly relevant, as they are, or going to be, working in industries that don't have collective agreements. This is where you can take the concept of joining a union further to joining the union movement. Rather than bombard them with big words like collectivism, I prefer to describe unionism as teamwork. And I like to not just lean on what unions can do for the worker. That's one side of it, but it's also what we have to contribute as part of a team to the movement and what we've got to contribute to society by joining the union movement. I almost discuss it in terms of it being a responsibility of people to participate in a union. You could say something like, look at what working people like you and me have achieved by teaming up and making our voices heard. We've won the right to basic things like a minimum wage, paid holidays, parental leave, and even laws that prevent children from getting exploited. Yes, workers had to fight for this. We've taken these things for granted, but workers in unions won these rights. Employers did not sit around a round table and decide to start dishing out fair conditions to workers. If we left them to their own devices and trusted them to know what's best for us, they would likely be far less generous. Unions can tackle problems that no individual worker can solve on their own. Why did the Avengers form a team? Sorry about the severe example. The Avengers joined a team, or formed a team, because they realized that Loki, the god of mischief, and the Chitauri invaders were too big a problem to fix by themselves. So they pulled together, did some collective action, and they stay a team because they can support each other and make life easier, even after they kick Loki's butt. Now, let's face it, 99% of young people will get their first start in the private sector. We know that. The unions most relevant to young people then are these three. And so these are the ones I like to keep fresh in their minds, rather than having a slide full of all the unions that are out there. It is important to emphasize that anyone can join a union from any industry and any occupation, that it is everyone's right, and that the more union members there are, the better off we all will be. But don't ram membership down their throats. You can offer to link people up with the relevant union to them after the class if they want to have a chat with you. Feel free to discuss your own union and examples close to home. In fact, I would encourage that. A good relationship is not where you shag the manager or co-worker at the Christmas office party. That usually gets a laugh from the class. Yes, my jokes are lame, but they work on teenagers. Ask the students what they think a positive working relationship looks like. In my experience, they often think of it in a one-sided way, in terms of what they have to do to stay on the boss's good books. So emphasize the reciprocal nature of a good working relationship. Here we reference good faith. But talking about good faith in terms of a good employment relationship is really the best way to discuss the application of good faith, because otherwise it can be a tricky subject to discuss, as it is a bit airy-fairy, so examples are important. Examples like these. But you can draw on your own employment and union experiences to illustrate what good faith and being reasonable is. Make sure you keep it basic, so that it's something that they can understand at their level. This slide's usually quite popular. It's about a young woman who had a big moan about her employer on Facebook, forgetting that she actually added her boss as a Facebook friend. So she's accused him of some pretty serious things, and he's obviously replied, and she loses her job as a result. Ask the students if they think this example is a fair and reasonable way for the worker to raise and resolve an issue, which is a good segue into a little chat about the risks of social media used in relation to employment. Mistreatment in the workplace. Previously, I had a lot more information included about bullying and sexual harassment and discrimination, etc. But due to the time constraints, I never got to discuss them in any meaningful way. Instead, I think it would be more beneficial to briefly discuss that no one should accept being a victim in these situations, and that their employer has an obligation to address any legitimate complaints about these issues. The next slide presents the basic process or processes for resolving issues. The kind of three-step ladder, and it is important that young people understand what they can do to resolve issues should they arise, because at the moment the majority of them don't know what to do, don't know what the best practice is. There's not a lot of time to talk about the various bodies they can go to, like MOBI and the Department of Labour or the Labour Inspectorate, the ERA, the Human Rights Commission, and to be honest, they shut off if you're talking about all those things anyway. But you should run them through the basic recommended procedures for raising issues, reminding them about the importance of raising issues in good faith. Elaborate on these by discussing mediation, personal grievances, and disciplinary hearings if you feel you have the time. This is our last section, leave entitlements. Obviously, I usually ask the students at this point to name the 5 essential forms of leave to get them thinking. Those being annual leave, sick leave, bereavement leave, parental leave, and statutory holidays. Get the students to respond to this question. It's a great icebreaker. You may find that leave entitlements is the area where students have had the most interaction with and therefore the most knowledge, so you can actually afford to discuss more of the intricacies of leave entitlements. For example, good practice in relation to requesting annual leave, the accumulation of annual leave, how does that work, and when and where it can be taken. You can split it up, you can even cash a week in. It is very important to discuss what happens to accrued leave when a worker leaves the job. A common issue is young workers not receiving their holiday pay when they resign or are dismissed. So tell them it is their money. Their employer has to give it to them when they leave. The only time an employer can make you take annual leave is during an official close down period. Occasionally I get asked about not taking paid holidays and accumulating massive amounts of leave so you can get a big payout. But close down periods are often used by employers as a way to prevent workers from building these up. The poor old casuals. This is very relevant to students, many of whom will likely be on a casual agreement, so drive it home that they should be expecting to receive an additional 8% on top of their agreed wage. Tricky employers sometimes roll this up into a wage rate or salary package, the buggers. Might be another good opportunity just to revisit casual jobs as well, because they are often misused by employers, can evolve into 0-hour contracts. You know, they're being given fixed hours or there's a regular pattern to their hours, but they only have casual protections because, of course, if a worker with a casual contract is being treated like a permanent worker, after a period of time, they actually become a de facto permanent worker, according to the law. Sick leave. This is another interactive candy opportunity. Ask them this question, see what they know. And here's the answer, of course. You can also tell them that employers can improve on these minimum rights. For example, around sick leave, they could take away the 6-month waiting period. I also tell a bit of another Facebook story where a worker called in sick and then he went to the beach or did something fun. He wasn't sick at all, of course, he was faking a sickie, and the pictures surfaced on Facebook and made their way to the employer and he got fired as a result. Not an altogether uncommon occurrence. The next one is bereavement leave. Often young people get personal grievances and bereavement mixed up, so ask them what they think this means and how much leave they can expect to get in the event of a family member's death, how much they think they should get. Because really, they're entitled to bugger all. Union contracts often have stronger bereavement entitlements, and this can be a good anchor for a conversation about union membership, but also about maintaining a good relationship with your employer. If you have that good relationship, then you're more likely to get more paid leave or better conditions around this when somebody unfortunately does pass away. Public holidays in New Zealand. We do have a few. Ask them this question, give them some candy for whoever gets it right. And in my experience, it can be a hard one for them to answer. It does end up a bit of a guessing game, and it is fun to watch them scramble for the answer. The answer being, of course, that there are 11 public holidays. Don't discuss each of these in detail, it'll take forever, but it is useful to talk about the variation in anniversary days, and if your knowledge is up to snuff, the meaning behind Labour Day, which also prevents another plug for unions. Yay! Of course, students want to know what they're entitled to if they have to work a public holiday, and you should drive home the fact that under no circumstances can an employer withhold their time and a half pay, even if you sign these away. Don't forget about the loo day too. Ask the students what they think they're entitled to in terms of breaks. They will almost certainly have no understanding about the new legislation, or even the old legislation. So it is useful to get their feelings about breaks before discussing the actual rules on the next slide. This also presents another opportunity to have a discussion about fairness, that good old thing we love. Gone are the days of compulsory breaks, unless you're a union member. Seriously though, this is another good plug for unionism, as union negotiated agreements tend to have solid break entitlements. As you probably know, you might be on one right now. Now we're at the end. This is a Kahoot quiz that you can do just to sum things up. If you have the time, you may not. You may find that you run out of time before you get to this point, depending on how much discussion there has been and how many questions you're being asked. Don't get hung up on this. It's very common for me not to complete the whole presentation. It is impossible to cover everything they need to know in just 50 minutes. If you do get to use this quiz, you will need to log in to Kahoot online. So again, you'll need Wi-Fi access, which will probably need to be arranged. The login details are available in the PowerPoint that you can download from the link in the Young Workers Reader Centre website and Stand Up website, and on a G drive which you may have been given access to. But the login, once you're at Kahoot, is YWRC@extra.co.nz is the email username, and the password is respect lowercase 11. So respect 11. Make sure if you're going to use it, that you practice facilitating it first. Familiarize yourself with Kahoot.